Hello, everybody, and welcome to Is This the Norm? I'm Laura.
I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Heather. And today I'm going to be talking about something called Lotus Feet. And what that is, something that was done in China for about 1,000 years. And it started in the 10th century during, I've heard two different times that it started. One was in the Song dynasty, and the other was the Tang dynasty, but those would have been about 950 AD. So anywhere between 950 to 960 AD is when this foot binding started in China. Just a quick on that is that the Chinese foot binding was a painful 1,000-year-old practice, which would create something called lotus feet, which was a symbol of beauty, wealth, and status. And when this would start, this foot binding was anywhere between the ages of 4 and 7. And what they would do is they would soak the feet, break the toes, and then bandage the toes very tightly under the sole, with bindings tightened over years to create a small, pointed, arched, and often crippled foot, meant to ensure a good marriage. So that's the basics. I'm going to get into the details of each of those processes. The quick history is this has only happened to women only. They should say girls, and it just went into your adulthood and all your life. It was historically associated with the wealthy. You bound your feet all your life from the time that you started forward. And another source that I found said that it went on until, well, let's back up. I told you in the dynasties about the 10th century, but it was banned in 1911. However, the practice continued in rural areas in China until 1949. And so there was some documentaries I was able to watch about where a woman in approximately 2011 went to these areas in the rural areas where these women were found that continued binding their feet into the late 1900s. And most of them are in their 90s. And so you can actually watch this and meet the women. I don't think any more are alive because this was in 2011, so it's many years ago. In the documentary, just to give it to you real quick if you want to watch it, is called The Last Golden Lotus: The Secret of Chinese Foot Binding, and you can find it on Tubi. And okay, so initially the practice started because I really wanted to find out like what started this, like where did it come from? I couldn't really find stuff. So the one part that I could find is that the initial practice was among elite dancers and noble women to symbolize status and beauty. And it was spread amongst all social classes by the, I think it's how you say, is King dynasty. The practice started as a fashion statement among court dancers, as for a concubine of the emperor who bound her feet to perform a lotus dance, creating a golden lotus foot. Now, what a golden lotus foot is, so you'll hear those terms like golden lotus foot versus lotus feet. So a golden lotus foot is a foot that's only 3 inches long. Yeah. Okay, Rebecca, here's your faces again. What's up?
I just started like looking at pictures, and ironically, it's very ironic that it was considered a symbol of beauty because they're ugly feet I'm looking at right now. It's gross looking.
I'll probably, when I put this on our social media, I'll put a picture of the foot so people really understand what the foot looks like, and I'll get off what I'm talking about here. But yeah, they would break the toes. A lot of the times the toes didn't break right away, so that was the whole point of the binding. So it was like a slow breaking, which I know sounds like that's just terrible. And then they're supposed to try to walk on these feet. What happens is the big toe is left, and those 4 toes is that they would soak them, and I'll talk about what they soaked them in, and then they would break them underneath to put it on the sole of the foot, and so then your big toe's left to create that point. So the point is another sign of beauty, is your big toe's left alone for the most part, other than the binding. And then they also are wrapping not just the front of the foot, but also the calcaneus or the heel, and they're pushing that together to make the arch more prominent. And so it's creating that smaller foot. So you can't, it's not just the breaking of the toes. You also have to push that heel forward or width into the toes. So you're getting that tight binding, like you're going to put a wrap on like an injured ankle, but much tighter. And then they would sew it so that girls that were young at like 4, 5, and 6 couldn't take off the binding because it was very painful. Yeah.
So I'm curious of like pain management. These are babies, a 4-year-old little girl. Are you going to get into that? Was there any kind of pain management for them, or was this just, how did that?
Yeah, I didn't see a lot about that. There is one woman that they interviewed, and another one I watched, I think it was on something that happened Queen Mary University, is that? I don't know what it was, some kind of news channel, but it was probably in the 2011 period where they interviewed some women that had Lotus Feet still, and they were in their 90s. And this woman is like crying about it. It's very vivid in my mind still on how painful it was. And like she had trauma from it. You could clearly tell that this woman, she was able to very vividly tell you about it. So I didn't hear any of the women talk about pain management other than they did. One thing I saw was that they would start the feet binding in the winter time when it was still cold. So that provided some relief from swelling. That's about the only pain. I'm sure they had herbs because there was a book I read. It's called Lady Tan's Circle of Women. And it talks about like the herbs they used and how they treated ailments. But I don't remember reading in that book because it's a historical fiction. I don't think it's historical fiction. No, it's actually based on a real woman. So, I mean, I think there is some fiction to it because they didn't know everything about Lady Tan, but she was a real person that wrote a book about all her remedies for different ailments at the time in the 1400s is when this book is based in China. And she talked about things for pain relief, but in the book, it never talked about giving pain relief to like her daughters where she did the foot binding or herself. So I don't know for sure.
So these 90-year-old women that are being interviewed, was there any kind of reversal of damage or anything that could make their feet normal again, or did they live with these itty bitty tiny feet their whole lives?
Yeah, I mean, by the time it was probably banned, the damage was done because you get pictures. There is pictures of their feet in their 90s. And from what I can see, yeah, the damage is done. Maybe they stopped binding it so then the heel wasn't being pushed against to make it smaller, but the toes are already broken. So that's not something that could be undone. And then I think the woman that was really talking about her trauma, it still hurts to this day. Like the pain just never goes away. It's a constant thing. And I'll get into why they did what they did. With outside of the beauty part, there was other reasoning behind this lotus foot. What was I going to talk about here? Okay, so I'll give you some more quick history about it. The shape of the bound foot was said to represent a lotus flower, hence the name Lotus Feet. And it was used to represent wealth and refinement, beauty, and to restrict a woman's mobility, becoming a prerequisite for marriage in many areas because you couldn't be a laborer. It was obvious that if you had lotus feet, you were in some type of status that, you're not going to be working. And then how it was done. So I told you they soaked the feet and then broke the toes, and the bindings tightened over the years to create the smaller and smaller foot. So as they could deform the bones, they could wrap it even tighter. But of course, you get this crippled foot. Talked about breaking the toes, pointed look. Yeah, like I said, the process usually started in the winter months so that the feet were numb and slightly less likely to feel pain. Slightly, I think, is the operative word there. So they began by soaking the foot of a young girl before the arch of the foot had a chance to develop fully. So that's why they were doing it at such a young age. And it was typically soaked in warm animal blood in which herbs had been steeped. So maybe the herbs in this animal blood helped with pain. I doubt it. The toenails were clipped as far back as they could to prevent ingrowth and infection. And then a foot massage was given, possibly as a last attempt at comfort, since the next step involved breaking every toe except the big toe. The arch of the foot was also forcibly broken. This was all done by pressing toes tightly down and into the sole of the foot. Like I said, bending your toes inward towards your sole, and then binding them even tighter with bandages soaked in the blood and the herb mixture. Like I said, it's not like a nice little gentle binding. They were pretty tight, and then they sewed it. The wrap was tight, much like you would wrap an injured ankle. And this tight wrapping was done so that though they broke the toes, it was to break them even more. So they were just, of course, unusable at that point. And then the natural concavity of the sole is greatly increased. Like I told you, you have the arch, and so they're really creating that pushing together of the front of the foot to the back of the foot. And then this procedure continued every couple days. So what you just happened, like a couple days later, unwrap it, do it all over again.
So they were like re-breaking when they would do it a few days later, or they would be tightening the bandage. I would imagine that they're putting this bandage on and tightening it, and that helps form it as well to go to whatever angle or what have you. But I have so many questions that probably can't be answered. But like these little kids had to have been bedridden. There's no way they can be walking around with broken toes like this. Like that's crazy.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times maybe they probably couldn't walk right away, but I know that as the process went on, they made them walk so they could get used to walking on this new foot of theirs. So yeah, in the book I read, that's what gave me the idea to do this podcast on Lotus Feet was from that book, which was not all about Lotus Feet. It was about Lady Tan and all her herbs, but she had her foot bound. Her daughters did. Her mom did. Her mom died from it. Also, it was very dangerous too. It could end in infection. They get gangrene on their toes. The toes would fall off. So they really had to make sure, like, that's why every couple days of this binding was to look for those signs of infection, clean the foot well, on top of making sure you get that look of the lotus foot, the smaller the better kind of thing. So I'm sure like you would break the toes, but sometimes who knows, like you couldn't break them all. So you would keep binding them, so decrease the integrity of your toes. So then maybe the next round you could actually break that toe, is what I've gathered from things I've read. With China now, at least from what I watched and read, is like this is an embarrassment to them. It's kind of shameful that this happened. They have this new regime that came in and banned it. And so the new thought process is that was bad. That wasn't good. It's shameful. So didn't really get into this in anything I read or watched, but I would imagine these women at the time that were still alive that had this lotus feet, it was probably shameful for them too, even though it was already the damage was done. They couldn't undo what had happened to them. So I'm sure didn't get into that, but I can imagine that they were probably shunned to some extent. I don't know. So yeah, I talked about, okay, sorry, I got off track there. Okay, so then another problem obvious from the pain and infection and ingrown toenails. And like I said, you'd lose some toes on occasion or your toenail, and then that wouldn't grow back, which might have been nice since then you wouldn't have somebody clipping them really short all the time. Also, the circulation to the feet became compromised, and which would cause necrotic flesh and infection, which was probably super painful. But if you lost a toe, sometimes this would be considered a benefit as it meant that the toes would drop off and unwanted flesh could be removed. Yeah, even if a toe did fall off, that's one less piece of flesh that's in the way. So that was considered a good thing. In certain circumstances, girls with fleshier toes or larger feet risked having shards of glass inserted deliberately to cause infection and ultimately necrosis of tissue, which could be sloughed away. Yeah. So, as if it's not already painful, they're going to put pieces of glass in your toes or part of your feet so it rots off. Unfortunately, this form of infection could lead to septic shock and death. Big surprise. Which this is like this dichotomy of this foot binding was that the mothers were typically the ones that had to do this to their daughters. And when I say dichotomy is that the mother knew that she had to do it so that her daughter could get married off well. But at the same time, I'm sure there was some serious internal turmoil, like I'm hurting my child. Lady Tan in the book alludes to that, where she hated doing it. It's so painful. She feels bad, but she knows she has to, and she just moves on from there. Not only trauma to the daughters, but trauma to the mom too. Like she's gone through it. Now she's having to put her daughter through it, and she doesn't have a choice. So I can only imagine those issues that came along mental health issues because they had to teach them the practice, right? The mom taught the daughter and so on and so forth. Like I said, they can make these feet as small as 3 inches. That's what would be considered a golden lotus. And that was the most desirable type of bride. So I saw a picture to give some kind of perspective to it. There's a picture of a hand where this person is holding two of the feet or a set of feet of golden lotus feet in a palm of a hand, and both feet fit in the palm of the hand. The hand is actually longer than 2 feet. It's probably a pretty big hand. My hand's maybe 5 inches, but yeah, if the feet are only 3 inches in somebody's palm, their hand could be even longer.
Where did this arbitrary 3 inches, you say? Where did that come from? Is there
I don't know. That's a good question. And like I said, I think that you researched something to the ends, but yeah, I don't know why 3 inches. Maybe that's just like the littlest foot they were able to ever get. And so that became the standard. How would you even walk if you had any less than 3 inches of feet? I don't know. That is a really good question.
I'm looking at my own foot and I'm like, my big toe is 1 inch. So there must be some kind of like stunt of bone growth from this binding to get to that small of a foot.
Yeah, that's why they did it at the young age because the bones were still pliable. They weren't set yet. So they were able to like squish the bones and go against the natural growth of the foot. Yeah.
Like stop the growth plates.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm not really good with growth plates, but people will be like, oh, you're a nurse. I guess I should have looked that up. But yeah, we have growth plates all over our body. So I'm sure there's probably one in there somewhere. I just don't know where. But yeah, it's like I said, they just bound it. It wasn't just the circumference of the foot, it was the circumference of the foot and then from the toes to the heel to squish it together. Because that's what I remember when I was in the book. I was like, okay, foot binding. I was thinking that they just bound it circumference wise, but then she was talking about the feet being so little. In the book, oh yeah, you'd see a woman that was of the working class and she would reference them, oh, so and so and her big feet. And that was a common theme that she would allude to in the book about women and their status and their big feet. So where was I at? Oh, okay. So yeah, and then the other thing is if they refuse, girls would get punished and often beaten if they did not bind their feet. So this one woman that was one of the women, not the one that was actively crying and reliving it as she's being interviewed, but another woman who was more stoic. She was like, "Yeah, if we didn't do it, we got beaten." So, you can get held down and get your feet wrapped and then also get beaten, or you can just sit there and go through one type of pain versus multiple types of pain. And then they were also told things like you would never marry if you didn't have small bound lotus feet. And so this threats like you'll be like a spinster aunt or spinster if you don't take care of your feet and do as you should, and you won't be able to marry off. And a lot of times they marry them off to wealthier families, so then you get more status through this marriage. So that was like the other thing, is that this poor little girl is getting her feet bound. She's got all this pressure that she's got to marry better and for more money. And this is happening at between 4 and 7 years old. It's crazy. And they married off pretty early. It was usually between 14 and 15. They would marry off and start having kids real early. So some of the side effects, of course, is they have something called like a lotus walk or lotus gait. I would call it like a lotus waddle almost, like a duck, because they could only walk on their heels because of the pain of walking everywhere else on their foot. So what little part of their foot they had left that was not excruciating, they'd walk on their heels and they'd hold on to like walls and other objects to prevent from falling. Again, you can't get very far. You won't be able to run away from anybody. It's a duck waddle. And because of the pain and deformity, they couldn't walk very far. They were transported in things called, back in the 14, 15, 1600s, called palanquins or palanquins. They're like a sedan chair. So I'm sure you've seen it in movies where they're carrying this chair that you're sitting in, but usually it was covered. So you'd have people carrying you as you get into this little cart. I don't know what it's like. It's a sedan chair. I'm sure you could look it up. And they would carry you that way because you couldn't walk very far. And then in the book, The Lady Tan Circle of Women is by Lisa C, by the way. And it gave examples of these Chinese women during the Ming Dynasty, which is 1368 to 1644. And it also tells you about the difficulties in these sedan chairs where she gets in them and then is transported to other areas, even if it's just 10 minutes away. They couldn't walk that far. Oh, and then like I was telling you about the necrosis and infection. Also in this book that I read, Lady Tan's mom, when she was a child, like deliberately stopped taking care of her feet in the binding because she kept at the beginning of the book, she's, oh, I'm sitting next to my mom and I can smell her feet. Like something's not right. And her mom had they don't really call it that in the book, but it is postpartum depression or depression in general. And Lady Tan inherits that and has problems throughout the book with it. So her mom like deliberately stopped taking care of her feet. They got necrotic and she got septic and died. And she was only 29 years old. By the time you're 29, you've had probably 3 or 4 kids. So that's what I'm saying is this is a lifelong thing. And if you don't properly take care of your feet, even into your older years, as they would call it at the time, you can die from this feet binding. They also had issues with higher rates of osteoporosis after researching this and looking at people's bone structures that died. There was this one place, I think it was Queen Mary University of London, where they have, which I thought was interesting, they had these feet in jars that they had kept as research. Yes, it's like a pickled foot pretty much that they have, and they show a picture of it. And I was like, that's gross. But another problem was mineral bone density was extremely low in the leg bones because they're just not getting that pressure that you need with walking to create the bone density. Another thing was they had something called muscular atrophy. So what that means is in the calves means that the muscle doesn't develop, and they have like these chicken leg calves because they're not walking much. So then your muscles don't grow, and so they're atrophy. And so that's another thing. Sorry to keep bringing it up, but the Lady Tan book talks about those skinny legs. And that was another way you could identify that a woman didn't have lotus feet, even if she was wearing a certain shoe that maybe made her foot look small. If she had developed calves, you knew she didn't have lotus feet. So this, of course, contributed to issues of walking and falling because you don't have any muscle. So it's not just the feet, it works its way up your legs and creates all these issues with being able to walk, which also contributed to a lot of falls. I'm sure this what made my mind go, which didn't really allude to this anywhere in the book or other things I read, but when you get pregnant, you're already unstable. From my education, they say that the biggest threat to a woman when she's pregnant is falls because you're just got all this weight in one area. It makes you unstable. So I could only imagine that when these women were pregnant, the instability must have been so much greater at that point. You know, I remember being pretty big, probably because of my bagel consumption. So that's on me. But going up and down our stairs, I had to go sideways. And I'm just thinking, I couldn't imagine if I had lotus feet, I would have been stuck on our main floor.
They were probably bedridden.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think like their last month of pregnancy, they usually were. Again, Chinese women are already a little smaller than a lot of Europeans and what have you. But it doesn't matter. It's the ratio of your feet to your height. Yeah, I couldn't imagine. I didn't get big into that because I think it's the obvious that, yeah, if you have lotus feet and you're really pregnant, I'm sure there was an increased risk or even more falls for those women. And they were in elite families, so I'm sure people like that they usually had one person that was their caretaker from a very young age throughout their life that would take care of them and dress them and all that. So I'm sure that person had to help them walk a lot, or they would be put in a seat. Because another thing they mentioned is after you're pregnant, you pretty much stay in your room for a month afterwards. After you have a baby, they call it the month. Yeah, the month before and then the month after. So yeah, there's a lot of bedridden time when related to pregnancy. So 1 to 2 out of 10 women were likely to die from the complications of foot binding. And of course, 7 to 8 out of 10 were injured. And I thought that was an interesting statistic because I'm going to say I think every single one of them was injured. So I'm not really sure what they mean by the 7 to 8, maybe like necrosis or other complications. And I'm assuming, yeah, that statistic is more due to infection, loss of toes, and probably falls. Yeah, I mean, they were mutilated. this is a mutilation thing. This is,
Absolutely.
yeah. And there was some statements I found where women would say, "I could not walk in the rain, on the street," so because of the risk of falling that they couldn't even walk in if it was raining outside, they had to stay home because of the risk of falling or getting injured. Let's see. Oh, and then so some miscellaneous information about lotus feet is there was beauty pageants related to the lotus feet that were bound. So like you'd go show off who had the best lotus foot, imagine. So there was stuff like that. And then another thing was that with women with these lotus feet, doing it all for the man so they could have marital status and get the best of the best, they would embroider their own booties. So these marriage booties are usually red. And so they would embroider them and make them. It was only for the marriage bed. So they would wear them. And then, like in the book that I read, her husband like holds her lotus foot. They never see the actual foot. They just see it in booties. So they don't really see the deformity of and how terrible it looks. They just see how small it is and this little booty that they embroidered. It's red, so it's sexualized, hyper-sexualized, these lotus feet. And so there's a part in the book where he holds her foot and says how beautiful it is and yada yada. And so another thing was that they would do is with with hypersexualizing these lotus feet is of course they wear dresses or gowns and just the tip of the toe would peek out or the one toe you have left would just peek out under your dress and that was like a sexual thing too. So, yeah, that's how you would sexualize it, and women that
It makes me think of Jerry Seinfeld when he was doing a stand-up comedy, and he was not talking about Lotus Feet, but just talking about if women wore hats all the time, we'd wanna see the tops of their heads. Like, it's just what they don't see. So it just made me think of that, just her little toe sticking out. Yeah, hypersexualized, but it happens in so many cultures, even in ours, but it makes me think of India and the dowry and Mauritania. The women there, they force feed their daughters to get really overweight because a obese woman is beautiful there. Anorexia was very popular in the 90s in the United States. Just it's common throughout history, huh?
yeah, yeah, it is true is the things that we do that we think is the trend of how we should look or what we should look like, but this extreme of mutilating a woman's body, you have 0 choice in it.
And I would also say like the idea of it is like for the man, but I feel like it's not necessarily just for the men, like the men are like bind your feet. You know what I'm trying to get at here? It's women do this in all cultures. It's a fad to be extra skinny in the 90s in the United States. Now it's a fad to be like the Kardashians and very curvy. Men haven't changed throughout history like women are changing, at least within like the United States. I'm hesitant to say we do it for men because men hardly notice. They're very easily pleased within the United States is what I'm getting at, but so not per the Lotus Feet per se, but yeah, you know what I'm
I think I know where you're going. You're basically saying this probably wasn't a man's idea. It was some woman thought this is the ideal beauty. It's very possible that it was women and not men. Who knows, but I mean, it was the women
Thank
that
you.
carried on this tradition, obviously. The women were doing it to the women for 1,000 years. All of those girls. I would rather have been poor. I want to be the Bigfoot peasant girl back then. No, I don't want to be rich. That's horrifying.
I kind of like all throughout history, I would want to be the poor person too, like the royalty in Europe and the inbreeding. Like sometimes it pays off to be poor, huh?
Yeah, I agree that because even in this book, it talks about her going with her friend that is like a midwife, which is they didn't have the lotus feet and she can walk about real easily. And she's like, hey, I need you to help out this lower class woman. She's trying to get pregnant and figure it out. And so, in order for her to hide her lotus feet, she puts on these bigger boots and I think she stuffs them with stuff. And it's probably not very long distance, but she talks about how tired she gets walking and trying to keep up with her friend. And then her friend that was doing pretty okay. She married like a tea guy and they make pretty good money. They're not like poor. Was able to walk freely and without issue. And she alludes to not doesn't allude to the fact that she wished she had big feet, but definitely talks about the difficulties in not being able to keep up with her friend. Oh, then another thing about these feet and being a potential bride, what they would often do would take the potential bride's shoe to the potential groom's family so they could see how small in the dimensions of her foot for consideration of matchmaking. So that was one of the things that would be done.
And again, I bet you it was the women of the husband's family that were reviewing this, would be my guess.
Yeah. No, you're right. Because even in the Lady Tan book, the woman that runs the household, the mother, because what you do when you get married, you go live in your husband's household. And then the mother-in-law, it's like this eat your young where she's really mean to her and very strict on her. And she has to get up every morning before her mother-in-law's awake, go to her room and make her tea. So there's this like ritual where you have to pretty much worship the mother-in-law who is running the household because the men are always gone. Like they're either doing stuff for the emperor, they're out this, doing that. It's the women that are stuck in this compound in essence. And the mother-in-law is the ruler of everybody, including the concubines. Yeah,
Next time you think your mother-in-law is bad,
yeah,
think back to this episode.
I couldn't imagine. Yeah, it sounds, and then you're not even supposed to go back and visit your family once you're married out. You have to ask permission if you want to. And usually in the book, it's like she only goes back when people are sick or something is needed at the other compound that she was at as a child. So it's like expected to like, once you leave your family, you're no longer a part of that family.
Belong to your husband.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the other thing with the Lotus Feet is it kept you from going very far. And they don't go outside these compounds either. They don't go out and see the world. They're stuck in that compound. The only time they get out is maybe to go from one place to the next. And you're not even supposed to be peeking out your window when you're being taken around in these sedan chairs. It talks about that in the book too, where she's like trying to peek and see things and you don't get to see the outside world. All right. And then, so the banning, I talked about the banning that happened and they tried to actually initially ban it in 1664, but they were forced to abandon those efforts due to just non-compliance. People just weren't complying, so they gave up. So there was a point in time where China was like, hey, this is not good. We need to quit doing this. But it was so embedded by that time. It's been going on since 960 AD, and now it's in the 1600s, late 1600s. Like that's 500 years right there. Hey, stop doing this. No, we've been doing this for 500 years. Get out of here.
Yeah, it's a cultural norm at that point. Hard to deviate from that.
Yeah. And then, of course, it started up again in the 1900s, and it was a little bit more successful. There was some influences by the Christian missionaries coming and being like, hey, yeah, this is not okay. And so that helped get that banning a little bit more aggressively. But so this was following the collapse of it's Qing, and hopefully I want to say it's Qing dynasty. They had a new government in the beginning around 1915. They imposed fines on families who continued to bind their daughters' feet. And then at some point they would go home to home asking for Lotus Feet shoes, confiscate them and burn them and make sure they didn't see anybody binding feet. So they really were like, we're done. You're not doing this anymore. So they started going out to the rural areas. And that's when, why it went on until probably the 1940s until almost the 50s is because maybe in the more urban areas, they were able to monitor it more, but then they were finding out in these rural areas that the women were still doing it. So they were going out to these rural areas, confiscating stuff, burning them. So in the documentary I watched, the women spoke to that, how they would come to the house, confiscate them and burn them. And because this woman that was doing this documentary was trying to find the booties, like examples of the booties that these women had in these rural areas. And they're like, no, that stuff is confiscated and burned. So no, we don't have any of our original shoes. And then the People's Republic of China, they're the ones that implemented these really strict bans. And although it was deeply rooted in these rural areas, the practice was finally eradicated, with the last factory producing shoes for bound feet closing in 1998.
Moly, that wasn't even that long ago. I was an adult. That's how old I am. I just keep thinking too, previously we've talked about instances where when you're exposed to the world in general, like bad things happen, but we could say that this is the other side of that because exposure to the world of this, the world was like, what in the world are you doing? This is not okay. And so China was like, oh, embarrassed. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there's other instances, but this is a prime example of if the world discovers these antiquated, horrible things that this culture is doing, maybe they stop doing them out of embarrassment.
Yeah, yeah, there's the influences of it. I mean, I think it was recognized in the 1600s as problematic. You don't have the resources to travel around and enforce not doing it, where you get into the more modern society. We have cars, ways to get around, a lot better road systems, so they were able to actively, like, just, "Okay, we're not doing this anymore. You're done." So, I think the industrialization of countries probably helped that out, and, of course, yeah, then the knowledge gets out, right? That the world knows, like you said, Rebecca, I think that's a prime example. You don't get to do that anymore. And then some modern day comparisons I thought about, which you alluded to, Laura, was like high heels, Botox, tummy tucks, breast augmentation, facelifts, extreme dieting, excessive exercise. But in all reality, there was and there is no comparison that caused such extreme pain and debilitation as the foot binding. As you know, with those examples, the one example I could find that is still going on, and I would say is maybe just as bad as initially happening, and of course, you likely heal from it. I don't know because I didn't get into it because that wasn't part of the podcast. But the closest thing I found, or I would say that is worse, is the female genital mutilation or FGM
Yeah,
done as a purity.
that was the other example I was thinking of where that was a cultural norm that the world outside, nobody else does that. That's not a good thing. Maybe you guys shouldn't do that anymore.
But they still do. And it's preparation for marriage, same kind of thing. And this happens between the ages of infancy and 15 years old, where they do, depending on where you live in the world, because it's concentrated in some African countries mainly. This is not what we're covering, but yeah, it depends on the mutilation. There's different levels of it on what they do. And it's done for purity reasons, and it allegedly creates more enjoyment for the husband having sex with you. Yeah, I'm not sure how that would relate, but that's one of the other allegations regarding this female genital mutilation that's still happening as we sit here today. It's banned, it's illegal, it's considered against our human rights to be doing that, and they try to cut down on it, but it's still happening.
Heard it as they did that mutilation so that the female didn't have pleasure in sex, so that she wouldn't stray from her husband. But the anatomy of a female, even if you take off the outside, there's still stuff on the inside that would help her still feel pleasure. Trying to keep it PG on the fly, but that was what I had read, that they had done that so that when the woman gets married, she doesn't feel pleasure, and so that she'll not stray away from her husband.
Yeah, I might be. I didn't get into it too much just because it wasn't about the podcast. But the other extreme that they do is they also sew them shut.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how
So
does that help anybody?
I don't know. Yeah, it's not good. Maybe we'll have to do an episode on that, but I just didn't want to. I think that would be a little less PG getting into that specifics. But yeah, it was just an example of mutilation happening to women till as we sit here today. And I would say that is not the norm, and it shouldn't be the norm. Now, other types of beauty
Agreed.
things that probably aren't very comfortable for women, I don't think it's forced on us. It's something we can choose to do or not to do most of the time, at least in the US. Yeah, that's all I have, unless you have anything further to ask?
No, thank you, Heather. It was really good. I learned a lot I didn't know about, so thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, very well. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
All right. See you later. Bye.